About 2,000 years ago, during the Han Dynasty, people discovered that nature had its own version of an explosion. Throw a green, hollow bamboo stalk into a bonfire, and the trapped air heats up until the wood violently ruptures with a sharp crack. This wasn't a game, it was a ritual of spiritual defense. Villagers believed these loud, sudden noises would frighten away a mythical beast called Nian and repel malevolent spirits that brought misfortune to the community. They called these early noisemakers baozu, or exploding bamboo. Long before the first grain of powder was mixed, the conceptual foundation for all pyrotechnics was already in place. These first explosive displays were designed to protect the home and celebrate a community's survival. They were a tool for peace, not a weapon for conquest. Centered in the Tang Dynasty, the story takes a turn toward the laboratory. Taoist alchemists spent centuries experimenting with minerals in a specific pursuit, the golden elixir. They were searching for a chemical compound that could grant a human being physical immortality. In the 9th century, one of these alchemists combined 3 medicinal ingredients. He mixed 75 parts saltpeter, a mineral used to treat fevers, with 15 parts charcoal and 10 parts sulfur. But the mixture provided no life-lengthening properties. Instead, when it met an open flame, it reacted with a sudden flash of purple fire and thick smoke. Contemporary records describe alchemists burning their hands and faces, and in some cases watching the very houses they worked in burn to the ground. The alchemists didn't see a weapon, they saw a dangerous failure. They labeled this volatile mixture huiyao, or fire medicine. The search for a way to prolong life had reached a paradoxical end. Instead of an elixir for immortality, they had discovered a substance so flammable it could destroy a home in a single flash. During the Song Dynasty, pyrotechnicians moved away from natural bamboo. They began packing the fire medicine into tightly rolled tubes of red paper, creating the first true manufactured firecrackers, ignited by a simple tissue paper fuse. These artisans were respected members of society. They used these controlled explosions to inaugurate festivals and ceremonies, believing the sparks helped positive yang energy rise to meet the heavens. But the focus was also shifting toward the battlefield. The Wu Jing Zongyao, a military manual from 1044, recorded the world's first exact chemical formulas for this powder, moving it from the alchemist's lab to the engineer's workshop. These early formulas were chemically limited. With only about 50% saltpeter, the powder didn't detonate with a shattering blast. Instead, it deflagrated, burning rapidly, releasing energy in a sustained wave rather than an instantaneous spike. Engineers realized this sustained burn was a benefit. Instead of shattering a container, the pressure was channeled into a thrust vector, turning the powder into a propellant for flight. Mastering the chemistry of this slow burn was the turning point. It transformed a festive curiosity into a predictable engine of propulsion. This led to the creation of flying fire. These were military arrows equipped with small tubes of gunpowder that propelled themselves deep into enemy ranks, terrifying both men and horses. They also developed the fire lance, a bamboo or metal tube mounted on a spear that ejected a blast of shrapnel and flame. It was the world's first proto-gun. By the 14th century, the Hualong Jing manual showcased designs that were centuries ahead of their time, including naval mines and even multi-stage rockets. The evolution reached its peak with heavy metal artillery. Massive cannons were cast in bronze, decorated with intricate dragon reliefs, and used to defend the cities of the empire. For centuries, the Chinese state used this chemical energy to support its existing order. Gunpowder was an investment in fortification and defensive supremacy, not internal revolution. The technology was used to stabilize a vast empire, maintaining a status quo that lasted for hundreds of years. The Mongol conquests of the 13th century forced this technology out of its birthplace. As their armies moved across Eurasia, they brought Chinese engineers and fire artillery units with them. When it arrived in the Islamic world, the ingredients told the story of their origin. Scholars there called saltpeter Chinese snow and referred to rockets as Chinese flowers. By the time the formulas reached Europe, they were received as a fully developed technology. European smiths didn't have to invent the mixture, they had to learn how to refine it. Once the secret traversed the Silk Road, it was no longer a guarded imperial asset. It was a global catalyst for a new kind of warfare. The impact of the powder was determined by the geography of the people who used it. While China remained a unified bureaucracy, Europe was a collection of fragmented, highly competitive states, locked in a constant arms race. European engineers pushed nitrate levels to their limits, creating heavy bombards. For the first time, a portable chemical charge could shatter a stone castle wall that had stood for centuries. This kinetic power ended the era of the armored knight and the impregnable castle, dismantling the old European feudal system. In the East, the powder provided the walls with better defense. In the West, it gave the attackers the power to tear them down. In the present day, the production of these chemicals has returned to its roots. China remains the center of the world's pyrotechnic industry, producing the vast majority of all fireworks. We have followed a 1,000-year journey from a Taoist accident to a global instrument of power, and finally back to a celebratory spectacle. The fire medicine still serves its earliest purpose. It paints the night sky, creating a shared moment of wonder for people on every continent. While the chemistry of gunpowder transformed the nature of conflict, its most lasting legacy is found in the joy it brings to our celebrations, proving that the urge to light up the dark is more enduring than the urge to destroy. If you strike a standard clay pot with a mallet, you get a dull thud. It absorbs the impact because common pottery is, at its core, baked mud. But when that same mallet strikes true porcelain, the material rings out. It behaves less like earth and more like resonant glass. Historically, Chinese artisans judged the quality of this material against 4 strict poetic standards. A perfect piece had to be as white as jade, as bright as a mirror, as thin as paper, and as resonant as a chime. Traditional clay could never meet those standards. It is highly porous, and if you expose it to the extreme heat required to make it waterproof, it simply melts or collapses on itself in the kiln. The solution was a highly specific mineralogical recipe, a binary formula. This diagram shows how it works. On a microscopic level, you start with kaolin, a highly heat-resistant white clay that acts as the structural skeleton. Then you mix in potence, a feldspathic rock that acts as the flesh. When this mixture is fired to 1300 degrees Celsius, a process called vitrification occurs. The potence melts into a glowing, translucent liquid glass. It flows through the kaolin skeleton, locking the entire structure into a solid, non-porous mass of glass and malite crystals. By discovering and perfecting this chemistry, Chinese potters engineered a material that was incredibly delicate to the eye, yet nearly indestructible in daily use. They set a standard of material excellence the rest of the world wouldn't match for centuries. The epicenter of this mastery was Jingdezhen. Situated in southern China, the city had access to a vast network of rivers for transport and sat right next to the Gaoling Mountains, the geographic namesake for the kaolin clay itself. To meet soaring demand, Jingdezhen developed a proto-industrial division of labor. A single bowl would pass through the hands of 72 distinct specialized masters, from the prospectors mining the rock, to the potters trimming the bone-dry clay, to the painters applying cobalt brushstrokes. But forming the clay was only half the process. The true engineering challenge lay in the fire. Over centuries, their kiln designs evolved to harness massive amounts of thermal energy. They relied on immense brick-arched structures, fueled exclusively by pine wood, which burns with the long, clean flames required to reach extreme temperatures, without covering the pottery in ash. By the Qing dynasty, they had perfected the zhenyao, an egg-shaped kiln designed with precise thermodynamic logic. This heat map shows how the sloping floor created distinct temperature zones. The white-hot firebox area fired pure white porcelain, while cooler rear zones fired temperature-sensitive colored glazes. This combination of highly specialized sequential labor and advanced thermal engineering transformed Jingdezhen into the largest industrial production base in the pre-modern world. With the chemistry and the kilns dialed in, different dynasties pushed the medium into distinct artistic directions. During the Song dynasty, the aesthetic focus was on elegant minimalism, producing pieces like ruware, famous for its subtle pale blue-green monochrome glazes and intentional crackle patterns. The Ming dynasty shifted to high contrast, popularizing the iconic blue and white style, or Qinghua. Artists painted intricate designs using cobalt oxide directly onto the unfired clay, which was then sealed permanently beneath a clear, glass-like glaze. Later, the Qing dynasty introduced complex overglaze enamels. Styles like Famille Rose, which used an opaque white enamel base, allowed painters to achieve soft, realistic shading on floral petals and incredibly fine lines on subjects like butterflies. This required multiple, carefully controlled firings to set the colors. For the pieces destined for the emperor, the standards were absolute. At the state-run official kilns, quality control was ruthless. Up to 96% of a kiln's yield would be deliberately smashed and buried to guarantee that only flawless ceramics reached the royal court. Every shift in artistic style over these centuries was a direct result of Chinese artisans gaining tighter, more precise control over the underlying chemistry and thermodynamics of the kiln. The pieces that didn't go to the emperor went to the rest of the world. Porcelain was transported from inland kilns down complex river networks to coastal trading hubs like Canton, where it was loaded onto merchant ships bound for the maritime Silk Road. For ship captains, porcelain was the perfect cargo. Because it is incredibly dense and heavy, they packed it into the hull's lowest levels as ballast, stabilizing the ship, while stacking lighter, highly profitable goods like tea and silk on top. The physical footprint of this trade was staggering. Archaeological excavations at ancient kiln and trade sites routinely uncover massive finds, densely packed layers of discarded shards and fused plates, a physical record of the sheer industrial volume pouring out of China. When these vessels reached Europe, they were treated as objects of supreme wealth and power. European nobility obsessively collected them. King Philip II of Spain, an early European monarch to amass a massive collection, viewed these imported ceramics as the ultimate display of royal status. By bridging the massive industrial output of the Ming and Qing dynasties with the royal courts of Europe and the Islamic world, porcelain became the first truly global luxury commodity. For centuries, China maintained a strict monopoly on the recipe. Desperate to replicate the aesthetic, European artisans resorted to innovation. The Dutch created Delftware, mimicking the Ming blue and white style by applying cobalt floral patterns and local windmill motifs to lower-fired, opaque, tin-glazed pottery. The genuine article remained so culturally dominant that the English language adopted a simple linguistic shorthand. The material became entirely synonymous with its nation of origin. They simply called it China. Over 2 millennia of steady experimentation, Chinese potters mastered the complex relationship between high alumina clay, feldspathic rock, and extreme heat. They engineered a material that reorganized global trade routes, redefined royal wealth, and permanently elevated the aesthetic standards of the world. A single continuous filament of silk can stretch up to 900 meters long. It is microscopically thin, just fractions of a millimeter wide, yet it possesses the tensile strength of iron wire of the exact same diameter. For centuries, the origin of this material was wrapped in a tidy legend. The story goes that around 2700 BC, the Chinese Empress Leizu was drinking tea under a mulberry tree when a silkworm cocoon dropped into her cup. The hot water dissolved the cocoon's glue, allowing her to pull a single shimmering thread. In the Neolithic tombs of Jiahu, located in central China, archaeologists uncovered evidence that completely contradicts that mythology. They found traces of silk dating back 8,500 years. Using mass spectrometry, an analytical technique that identifies chemical signatures, scientists tested the ancient burial soil. They found the distinct degradation products of silk fibroin proteins. The deceased were wrapped in silk shrouds nearly 4,000 years before the legendary empress was even born. The 8,500-year-old evidence at Jiahu reveals that silk production began with deep prehistoric human observation and the systematic exploitation of the natural world. In those early millennia, this luminous fiber was kept isolated from daily life. It was treated as a sacred medium, a physical bridge reserved exclusively for communicating with the divine. We see this vividly in the Bronze Age. Inside the sacrificial pits of the Sansangdui site, modern researchers discovered silk residues directly coating massive bronze masks and jade artifacts. The ancient Shu people observed the silkworm's life cycle, its transformation from a voracious worm into a dormant pupa, and finally into a winged moth. To them, this biological metamorphosis represented a supernatural conduit between heaven and earth. Over the centuries, that divine connection hardened into a strict marker of earthly authority. By the later dynasties, this concept physically manifested in garments like the long pao, or dragon robe. The ruling elite monopolized the production of a material that literally refracted light. By controlling who could wear it, they visually encoded their absolute political and cosmic authority right into the fabric of the state. Maintaining that authority required total command over an unforgiving biological system. Sericulture relies entirely on the Bombyx mori silkworm, an insect that survives on an exclusive diet of white mulberry leaves. China's geography provided a massive natural advantage. The local monsoon climate allowed mulberry plants to grow rapidly as bushes, producing vast amounts of leaves almost immediately. In the drier Mediterranean, these same plants had to grow into full-size trees, requiring up to 8 years before they could yield enough leaves to sustain a viable worm colony. When a wild moth emerges, it secretes an enzyme that breaks the cocoon apart, destroying the continuous fiber. To successfully harvest an unbroken 900-meter filament, farmers must carefully stifle the pupa with heat before it can hatch. Then comes the critical chemical phase. Raw silk is coated in a natural glue called sericin. By boiling the cocoons in a highly controlled degumming process, workers strip away this stiff resin, leaving the fiber soft and porous enough to absorb brilliant mineral and plant dyes. China maintained a global monopoly on silk for thousands of years because sericulture is an intense, multi-stage agricultural science. An outside empire could not replicate the industry simply by stealing a few eggs. Once the biological process was mastered, the challenge shifted to mechanical engineering. During the Han Dynasty, Chinese weavers developed the multi-heeled pattern loom. This machine functioned as an early programmable computer. By using sliders and hooks to lift specific warp threads, the loom recalled complex shedding information. This mechanical memory let weavers execute repeating geometric designs flawlessly. The data was physically encoded into the machine itself. This foundation eventually led to the development of kasi, or cut silk tapestry. Weavers used separate color bobbins for each section, leaving tiny structural gaps between colors to create the optical illusion that the three-dimensional designs were carved directly into the fabric. Chinese silk production refined a simple biological thread into a medium for recording physical data and high art. With production scaled up by these advanced looms, silk transitioned from a luxury good into a standardized instrument of state finance during the Han and Tang dynasties. The government paid official salaries in lengths of silk. Farmers paid their taxes in grain and silk. In the markets, the price of everyday goods was calculated using silk as a standard unit of account. We see the convergence of this fiscal value, textile engineering, and state ideology in artifacts like the Han Dynasty 5 Stars arm guard. Woven with 220 warp threads per square centimeter, it bears a complex astrological inscription, prophesying that an alignment of 5 planets in the east will benefit China. Silk drove the internal fiscal economy, while simultaneously serving as a physical canvas for projecting Chinese geopolitical ideology. The emperors utilized this invaluable asset in their international diplomacy. By gifting silk to neighboring states, China sparked an insatiable, continent-spanning obsession. When the fabric reached the Roman Empire, its shimmering, prismatic structure caused a sensation. The material commanded an astronomical price, and wearing silk became the ultimate status symbol for the Roman elite. Around 550 AD, 2 Byzantine monks successfully smuggled live silkworm eggs out of Asia, hiding them inside hollow bamboo walking staves. The secret was out, and sericulture slowly took root in the West. But the sheer gravity of Chinese silk had already done its work, carving out the massive arid arteries of the Silk Road across Eurasia. Over thousands of years of careful biological observation and mechanical innovation, the mastery of a single fragile filament wove together the first truly global network of trade, technology, and human connection. Look closely at these misty mountains. Every true tea variety on Earth, from the delicate white teas of Fujian to the robust black teas of Assam, originates right here from a single plant species, Camellia sinensis. But the first people to harvest these leaves weren't sipping a fragrant, relaxing beverage. Before the Han Dynasty, the Chinese boiled raw tea leaves into a harsh, bitter soup, tossing in pungent ingredients like ginger, onions, and citrus peels to aid in detoxification. Taking that pungent medicinal broth and turning it into a refined global export required centuries of deliberate, painstaking botanical engineering. The evolution of Chinese tea culture is the story of human ingenuity learning to control the volatile chemistry of a single wild leaf. By the Tang Dynasty, producers preserved the harvest by steaming the leaves and pressing them into dense, heavy bricks. To drink it, you had to break off a piece, grind it into a fine powder, and boil it in a cauldron. The Song Dynasty elevated this process into a highly competitive art form. Instead of boiling powder, they milled the tea into a microfine dust and rapidly whisked it with hot water to create a thick, vibrant froth. In the late 14th century, the first Ming emperor issued a decree that banned those labor-intensive compressed cakes entirely, forcing the country to adopt loose-leaf tea. To preserve these loose leaves, artisans developed sha qing, which translates to killing the green. They tossed fresh leaves into a searing hot wok, using dry heat to instantly deactivate the enzymes that cause the plant matter to brown. This specific shift to loose leaf and pan firing redirected the trajectory of tea, establishing the method for the steeped beverage consumed today. This animated diagram maps the 6 major categories of Chinese tea based on chemical processing. By controlling oxidation, artisans create entirely different profiles from the exact same plant. On the far left, at 0% oxidation, green and white teas remain chemically fresh, producing delicate flavors. Moving down the spectrum to 100% oxidation, oolong and black teas are bruised and exposed to air, creating complex, darker profiles. Sitting as an outlier is pu'er. This category relies on microbial fermentation, allowing the tea to age and deepen over decades. Perfecting and codifying these 6 distinct chemical profiles remains China's greatest technical contribution to the global tea trade. Long before the Ming Dynasty categorized these 6 types, an 8th century scholar named Lu Yu wrote the Classic of Tea. He outlined precise rules for water quality, brewing tools, and mindfulness, elevating tea preparation into a strict spiritual and aesthetic discipline. Achieving Lu Yu's vision of harmony required highly specialized engineering. During the Ming era, craftsmen invented the zisha teapot, molded from unglazed yixing pie. Because this specific clay is highly porous, it chemically absorbs the natural oils of the tea. Over years of use, the interior of the pot becomes seasoned, actively enhancing the flavor and aroma of every subsequent brew. These tools are the centerpiece of gongfu cha, which translates to making tea with skill. It is a meticulous ceremonial practice with exact water temperatures and multiple extremely short steeps. This reverence extends to the guests. When a host pours a cup, it is traditional for the guest to tap 2 fingers lightly on the table, a physical gesture of gratitude known as the finger kowtow. Away from the scholar's quiet precision, everyday Chinese tea houses are loud, vibrant communal spaces filled with bamboo furniture, card games, and lively conversation. Through strict ceremonial texts, highly engineered clay vessels, and crowded neighborhood tables, this simple beverage acts as the social and spiritual glue across all classes of Chinese society. As Chinese artisans refined their cultivation methods, the resulting leaf became immensely valuable, driving the creation of massive international trade networks centuries before European ships arrived. On the perilous Tea Horse Road, porters carried heavy bundles of compressed tea on foot across rugged mountain passes. This tea was so highly prized that it served as an actual physical currency traded for Tibetan horses. To the east, the Tang and Song dynasty practices of whisking finely milled tea powder traveled to Japan, directly laying the foundation for the revered Japanese tea ceremony. By the 17th century, the maritime Silk Road connected China to Europe. Merchants specifically chose to export fully oxidized black tea, knowing its stable chemical profile would survive the long, damp ocean voyages. The technical processing choices made by Chinese artisans dictated exactly which styles of tea foreign nations consumed and eventually integrated into their own cultures. Those Chinese black tea exports quickly became a staple of Western social life, weaving themselves into the daily routines and Victorian customs of Europe. Every global tea ritual, from a British afternoon service to a precise Japanese ceremony, relies entirely on the successful botanical manipulation of one single plant species native to China. The sovereignty of the leaf is the result of thousands of years where Chinese botany, craftsmanship, and philosophy merged into a single global practice. When we picture ancient Chinese engineering, we usually think of stone, like the Great Wall, but the structures that actually kept a quarter of the human population alive over 2 millennia were built from soil and water. At the core of the imperial state was Ben, a philosophical concept translating to the root. This doctrine dictated that farming was the absolute foundation of all political stability and cosmic order. To protect this root, the government did not leave crop yields to chance. During the Han Dynasty, the state orchestrated a systematic overhaul of farming tools, treating agriculture as a centralized imperial science. Consider the iron plow. Chinese metallurgists developed the heavy moldboard plow, featuring a distinctly curved iron plate. Instead of simply dragging through dirt, this curved shape created a mechanical advantage that lifted, inverted, and aerated the soil, burying weeds in a single fluid motion. They applied the same engineering rigor to planting. While European farmers would spend the next 1,000 years broadcasting, scattering handfuls of seed randomly across a field, Chinese engineers invented the multi-tube seed drill. This mechanical sower deposited seeds deep into the earth in precise, mathematically even rows. By combining advanced metallurgy with precise mechanical tools, the Chinese state secured a reliable caloric baseline. They established a population density and an agrarian foundation centuries before Western nations developed similar capabilities. This engineering mindset scaled up to entire landscapes. In the Sichuan Basin, officials constructed the Duzhongyan irrigation system, which transformed the region into a permanent food basket. Duzhongyan is a marvel of fluid dynamics. Instead of building a rigid, destructive dam to block the river, ancient engineers used artificial islands and spillways to naturally divide the flow. This allowed them to manage severe floodwaters while safely directing irrigation to the surrounding plains. When they ran out of flat floodplains, they engineered the mountains instead. In the southern province of Yunnan, the Hani people carved over 3,000 levels of rice terraces directly into the slopes of the Ailao Mountains. These terraces operate as an integrated four-fold ecological system. Mountaintop forests act as reservoirs, capturing rainfall. That water is then gravity-fed down through human villages, into the rice paddies, and finally into habitats for livestock and fish before evaporating back to the peaks. Even on marginal, wind-swept plots, farmers manipulated the microgeography. They developed Daitianfa, an alternating field system. By planting crops in deep furrows one year and on high ridges the next, they shielded vulnerable young shoots from harsh winds while trapping scarce moisture. Whether rerouting major rivers or sculpting individual furrows, the state and its farmers proved they could force the most hostile, unyielding geographies to yield a reliable surplus. Extracting that much food from the exact same plots of land year after year quickly drains the soil of nutrients. To survive, Chinese agriculture relied on closed-loop biological recycling. In the Pearl River Delta, this took the form of the mulberry dike fish pond system. Farmers built elevated dikes out of wet mud to grow mulberry trees, while cultivating fish in the excavated ponds below. The biology formed a perfect loop. Farmers fed mulberry leaves to silkworms. Silkworm waste dropped into the ponds to feed fish. The fish excrement fertilized the pond mud. Finally, farmers dredged that nutrient-dense mud, piling it back onto the dikes to fertilize new mulberry trees. This obsession with recycling extended into the cities through a booming trade in commercialized human waste, historically known as night soil. Urban waste was a prized commodity. Specialized merchants collected it from cities and transported them to rural farmers. This created a vital metabolic bridge, ensuring the nutrients consumed by city dwellers were continuously shipped back to replenish the farmland. To scale these complex ecological and mechanical systems across millions of square miles, the government relied on nongshu. These were encyclopedic agricultural treatises, written, printed, and distributed by state officials. In the 14th century, an official named Wang Zhen took these texts a step further by adding detailed, illustrated blueprints. A local magistrate in a distant province could look at an illustration and see exactly how farmers used specific new agricultural tools. This network allowed the state to treat its agrarian knowledge as an empire-wide operating system. Through woodblock printing, a central bureaucracy could deploy a standardized set of best practices to every district simultaneously, ensuring that a technical breakthrough in the south could be replicated in the north in a matter of months. By the 18th century, the sheer scale and unmatched stability of Chinese agrarian statecraft caught the attention of European intellectuals. A group of French economic thinkers known as the physiocrats, who argued that agricultural land was the sole source of all national wealth, looked directly to China. They modeled the foundations of modern Western economic theory on Chinese agricultural governance. But China's longest-lasting contribution to global agriculture is genetic. During the Song dynasty, the state imported and distributed champa rice, an early ripening, drought-resistant grain originally from Southeast Asia. Because champa rice matured quickly, farmers could pull off 2, sometimes 3 harvests a year on the same plot of land. This surge in production permanently shifted the demographic and economic weight of the empire to the southern provinces. Centuries later, agricultural scientists isolated a direct genetic descendant of that early rice. It was a specific strain called DGWG, a short, sturdy mutant variety that resists toppling over in heavy winds. That specific dwarfing gene became the biological backbone of the 1960s global green revolution. By crossbreeding DGWG, scientists created IR8, widely known as miracle rice. This incredibly dense, high-yield crop prevented global famine, saving millions of lives across the developing world in the 20th century. Today, as the modern world desperately searches for high-yield, sustainable farming methods, from closed-loop ecology to resilient crop genetics, we are still relying on blueprints drafted by Chinese agricultural scientists over 2,000 years ago. Watch this temple closely as the ground violently shakes. The massive, heavy roof sways back and forth, but the building does not collapse. This incredible resilience comes from a structural element known as the dogong. The dogong is a complex system of interlocking wooden brackets that joins the vertical pillars to the horizontal frame of the roof, relying on absolutely no nails, screws, or glue. Look at this structure beneath the eaves. The pieces are held together purely by the friction of their precise joints and the downward compressive weight of the roof. Because these unfastened components can shift, rotate, and extrude slightly during a tremor, they actively absorb and dissipate seismic energy. This highly engineered joint became the basic building block that allowed a civilization built of wood to survive millennia of severe tectonic activity. To an outside observer, traditional Chinese architecture can look repetitive. From rural homes to grand imperial halls, the buildings often shared the exact same sweeping roofs and wooden timber frames. This is the Louvre in Paris. In the West, classical architecture often relies on rigid stone to reach vertically toward the heavens, creating a massive, static sculpture designed to be viewed from the outside. Chinese timber architecture operates on a completely different logic. It is designed to be navigated horizontally, unfolding as a rhythmic journey through space and time. Notice the layout of this complex from above. The design creates what is known as a deep mansion. It forces visitors to walk through an alternating sequence, moving from the solid, enclosed wooden rooms into the open, airy voids of the central courtyards. The priority here is the dynamic human experience of moving through changing physical environments, rather than standing still and staring at a single towering facade. In the year 1103, the imperial government published the Yingzhou Fashi. It was a comprehensive state building manual designed to standardize construction methods, calculate exact material needs, and eliminate corruption among local contractors. You can see in this manual diagram how complex the carpentry had become. The state had to document the precise dimensions for thousands of individual interlocking parts to ensure they fit together perfectly across the empire. Watch how this single block of wood, called the cai, dictates the rest of the structure. The cai fen system was a strict modular code, where the width of one standard timber established the mathematical proportions for the entire building. By scaling these modular blocks, builders could efficiently construct massive curved roofs. These specific slopes were engineered to capture low winter sunlight while throwing heavy summer rain far away from the delicate wooden pillars. If you look at the ridge of an imperial roof, you will see a specific number of glazed beasts. The state dictated that only the highest-ranking buildings could display a high number of these figures or feature fully hipped, multi-eaved roofs. By strictly enforcing these mathematical and aesthetic rules, the Yingzhou Fashi turned architecture into rigid grammar. It gave the government total administrative control over the physical shape of the built environment. Because the system was strictly modular, it scaled effortlessly. A single room expands into a structural bay, and 4 of those bays enclose a central space to form a Sihui-wen, the traditional domestic courtyard. This is the Forbidden City in Beijing. Despite its massive size, it is built using the exact same symmetrical courtyard logic as a commoner's house, just multiplied on a grand interior scale. Inside the Hall of Supreme Harmony, you find the same friction-based joinery used in rural homes. The timbers are simply much larger and covered in intricate, state-approved paint. The colors themselves were highly regulated. Red represented fire and life for the walls, while the golden yellow roof tiles symbolized the earth element, a hue legally reserved exclusively for the emperor. Because the emperor's palace shared the exact structural DNA of a regular family home, it physically reinforced the idea that he was the paternal head of a massive nation-spanning household. This grid illustrates the rules of the Kalgongji, an ancient urban planning text written around 500 BC. It prescribed an idealized square capital city divided by 9 vertical and 9 horizontal streets, with the ruler's palace placed perfectly in the center. That ancient, idealized blueprint still exists today. It forms the 8-kilometer central axis of Beijing, a continuous, invisible line that continues to govern the layout of the modern city. This axis acts as the spine of the capital, links ancestral temples in the south, runs directly through central palaces, and stretches to northern commercial markets, locking society into strict spatial order. By locking the imperial throne directly onto the central meridian, the architecture visually positioned the ruler as an immovable pivot point between heaven and earth. This is the Yingshen wooden pagoda. Built in 1056, it stands merely 70 meters tall and has survived intense earthquakes and artillery fire, proving the extreme durability of this flexible, all-wood construction. The highly standardized prefabricated approach, laid out in manuals like the Yingzhou Fashi, predates modern modular construction theories by nearly 1,000 years. We see that legacy today in aerial shots like this. The ability to mass-produce standardized units off-site and assemble them rapidly allows for the construction of massive facilities, like entire hospitals, in a matter of days. Notice the inverted pyramid design of the 2010 China Pavilion. Modern architects are explicitly scaling up the ancient dogong bracket, turning a hidden structural joint into a monumental symbol of sustainable engineering and cultural identity. When builders standardize their materials and allow their structures to flex with the earth rather than fight it, they achieve a profound balance with nature. Traditional Chinese architecture provided a highly adaptable, modular grammar of space. After 3,000 years, that strict mathematical logic remains a viable, resilient template for building in harmony with the physical world. Look at the Crab Nebula. It is a violently expanding cloud of gas and radiation, 6 light-years wide, the physical debris left behind by a massive supernova explosion. Modern astrophysicists know the precise date this nebula was born, July 4, 1054 CE. But we didn't calculate this state by running models backward through a supercomputer. We know it because on that exact day, astronomers in medieval China documented the sudden appearance of a guest star, or kexing, the classification they used for temporary phenomena like supernovae that suddenly appear among the fixed stars. For over 2 millennia, the Chinese Empire maintained the most rigorous, continuous astronomical dataset on the planet. Through meticulous daily observation, they built an accidental bridge between ancient political philosophy and modern astrophysics. To understand how we map the deep universe today, we have to look back at why an ancient empire believed its absolute survival depended on the stars. During the Zhou dynasty, political power was formalized under a doctrine called the Mandate of Heaven. This principle dictated that the right to rule was granted directly by the cosmos, awarded to virtuous rulers and revoked from incompetent ones. They viewed the universe as an interconnected system. Earthly governance was only considered legitimate if it perfectly reflected celestial harmony. If the sky was orderly and predictable, the emperor's rule was valid. The political stakes for the emperor were absolute. His authority rested on his ability to accurately predict seasonal shifts, planetary alignments, and celestial events. Failing to predict a solar eclipse or allowing the agricultural calendar to drift out of sync with the seasons was interpreted as a loss of cosmic favor. A missed calculation provided the ideological justification for rebellion. Because celestial anomalies could topple dynasties, observing the night sky became the highest stakes intelligence operation of the state. This pressure created a system entirely distinct from the West. Rather than relying on isolated, independent scholars, the Chinese state institutionalized astronomy. They created the Bureau of Astronomy. This was a permanent government department staffed by hereditary professionals who passed down strict, standardized observational protocols from generation to generation. This established the practice of official astronomy. The raw data of the stars was treated as a classified state secret, accessible only to specialized civil servants whose sole job was to interpret the heavens and advise the emperor. Because the Bureau was deeply embedded in the state apparatus, this bureaucratic machine survived wars, famines, and regime changes, maintaining an unbroken chain of data collection for centuries. By turning astronomy into a bureaucratic mandate for political survival, Imperial China built the most robust and enduring scientific archive in human history. Chinese astronomers mapped the sky using a framework entirely independent from the Greeks. While Western astronomy focused on the ecliptic, the path of the sun, the Chinese system was equatorial, centering their coordinates on the north celestial pole. They divided the sky into the 28 mansions, or Ersheba Shu, a lunar zodiac system designed to track the moon's monthly progress across the stellar background. Their observations are preserved in the Dunhuang star chart from 649 CE, the world's oldest complete star atlas. This grid illustrates how it accurately plots over 1,300 stars. The chart utilizes complex mathematical projections to flatten the spherical sky onto paper centuries before Europe. Generating this level of mathematical accuracy across hundreds of years required precision instruments far beyond simple naked-eye observation. To control the calendar and secure the mandate of heaven, the empire had to pioneer mechanical technologies to measure the sky. The core physical instrument of the Chinese observatory was the armillary sphere. This physical model of the celestial sphere consisted of nested metal rings used to measure the exact coordinate positions of stars. Back in the 2nd century, the Han Dynasty polymath Zhang Heng automated the armillary sphere using hydraulic power. By linking a highly calibrated water clock to the gears of the celestial mapping tool, his physical instrument rotated in perfect, continuous synchronization with the real-time movement of the night sky. In the 11th century, the Song Dynasty empirical scientist Shen Kuo improved their calibration by discovering magnetic declination. He realized that a magnetic compass does not point to true astronomical north, but slightly east, a crucial correction for aligning large observational instruments. These compounding innovations reflected their profound cosmological view. The universe was a predictable clockwork system that could be replicated by human engineering. By the 13th century, traditional armillary spheres had reached a functional limit. They had become bloated with complex rings and heavy decorative elements that physically obstructed the observer's view of the stars. Yuan dynasty astronomer Guo Shoujing recognized this flaw and set out to optimize the empire's tools strictly for pure data collection. He designed the simplified armillary. He stripped away traditional horizon and meridian rings, separating equatorial and ecliptic rings into decoupled mechanisms. This maximized optical clarity. Observers now had a clear field of view, drastically reducing human error during late-night coordinate tracking. Using this tool, Guo calculated the length of the tropical year to exactly 365.2425 days. That is the exact value adopted by the modern Gregorian calendar, calculated centuries earlier. By stripping away ritual decoration and treating astronomy strictly as an empirical engineering problem, Guo Shoujing achieved the limit of naked eye precision. Today, modern astrophysicists are actively utilizing this incredible 2,000-year-old political dataset to solve complex modern problems regarding the Earth's long-term planetary dynamics. Consider tidal friction. The gravitational pull of the moon creates friction that is slowly acting as a brake on the Earth's spin. Our days are getting longer by mere milliseconds, a planetary deceleration metric known as delta T. Modern physics models can calculate the mechanics of this deceleration, but they cannot measure deep time changes without historical anchor points to verify the math. This map demonstrates how researchers use ancient Chinese solar eclipse records to find those anchors. By taking the location where ancient astronomers recorded seeing total darkness and comparing it to where modern models dictate the eclipse should have occurred, physicists measure the discrepancy to calculate the exact rate of Earth's deceleration. Without these meticulous ancient records, our understanding of the Earth's long-term rotational dynamics would be theoretical guesswork. The Bureau's records extend far beyond eclipses. Ancient astronomers diligently tracked sunspots and aurorae, logging them in state chronicles as black spots or atmospheric vapors. This visualization tracks how naked eye observations provide modern solar physicists with a 2,000-year proxy to chart historical magnetic activity. These records help identify extreme historical space weather events, corroborating massive cosmic ray spikes detected in tree rings from 993 CE. The data also maps the outer solar system. Halley's Comet completes an orbit roughly every 76 years. Chinese observers meticulously recorded the specific trajectory of every return of Halley's Comet since 240 BCE. This continuous log allows modern physicists to calculate non-gravitational forces acting on the comet. Specifically, they measure the effect of outgassing jets, plumes of gas and dust released as the comet warms up, acting like tiny thrusters that push it off its gravitational orbit. A bureaucratic obsession with recording every cosmic anomaly to protect the emperor accidentally provided humanity with a deep-time diagnostic tool for our entire solar system. A system born from the need to justify political power, ultimately drove a triumph of mechanical engineering and structured data collection. The initial motivation was the political survival of a dynasty, but the byproduct was an enduring monument to empirical science. The astronomers of the celestial bureaucracy mapped the raw data points that modern science relies on to comprehend the physical universe today. Humanity's longest-running astronomical dataset was born from the profound belief that the sky and the Earth are fundamentally one. For 3,000 years, the Chinese Empire relied on a specific technology to administer its vast territory, codify its social hierarchy, and preserve its cultural memory. That technology was the book. Before paper or print, the act of writing was intensely physical. It required the exact chemistry of lamp-black ink and the precise mechanics of pressing a brush into raw, fibrous materials. The history of Chinese publishing reflects a highly complex information ecosystem, driven at every stage by physical constraints and economic optimization. To comprehend how Chinese civilization sustained itself across millennia, we must examine exactly how it engineered the hardware to store, retrieve, and scale its collective memory. The earliest recognizable books were jianxia, documents made of thin, prepared strips of bamboo or wood. Because these strips were physically narrow, scribes were forced to write in a single downward line, permanently establishing the vertical, right-to-left flow of the Chinese script. Bamboo was highly durable, making it ideal for permanent state administrative records. However, the sheer weight of the wood and the horizontal binding strings made it cumbersome for mass data storage or long-distance transport. Scribes also utilized boshu, or silk, as a writing surface. Silk offered a seamless flat plane that was perfect for rendering complex spatial data, like maps and continuous diagrams. But its high cost restricted its use to the highest echelons of the social hierarchy. These early materials established an initial architecture of knowledge. Information was highly durable and resistant to decay, but it was physically heavy and economically restricted to the top of the imperial order. The formalization of paper around 105 CE was a deliberate economic optimization strategy. By utilizing cheap, recycled materials like tree bark, hemp, and fishing nets, artisans created a radically new writing substrate. Paper replicated the smooth, continuous flexibility of silk, but it did so at a fraction of the manufacturing cost. This cheaper material triggered a scaling effect across society. It accelerated the expansion of the state bureaucracy by making record-keeping affordable, and it fueled a rising demand for the mass copying of Buddhist sutras. Cheap paper was the hardware upgrade that removed the physical bottleneck of heavy bamboo, making the empire-wide transmission of complex thought economically possible. By the 7th century, China transitioned to xylography. Xylography is a printing technique that involves carving text and images onto wooden blocks, inking them, and pressing them onto paper. This shift was driven by the demands of mass religious merit-making and the state's need for administrative uniformity. The precision of early block carving is visible in the 868 CE Diamond Sutra, the oldest extant dated printed book, which features a highly complex layout and flawless visual fidelity. There is a persistent historical misconception, often called the Gutenberg fallacy, that assumes movable, uniform lead type is the natural, superior endpoint of printing technologies. This compares a 26-letter Latin typecase to a massive Chinese typecase. Casting and storing thousands of movable type pieces creates a logistical burden. Woodblock printing, however, allowed on-demand reprints by pulling a single stored block. Furthermore, woodblocks preserved the fluid, continuous brushstrokes of literati calligraphy, which rigid metal type destroyed. The enduring Chinese preference for woodblock over movable type represented a rational economic and cultural optimization suited precisely to its environment. As the volume of printed data grew, the physical morphology of the book adapted to enable faster data retrieval and navigation. This diagram illustrates the evolution from the continuous scroll to the pleated accordion fold. This method of folding a long scroll back and forth creates distinct pages, allowing readers to skip to specific sections without unrolling the entire text. This folding technique eventually led to the Xian Zhuang, or thread-bound book, which dominated the Ming and Qing dynasties. Known as Xian Zhuang, this method uses silk thread to stitch folded pages together through a series of holes. This format made the book lightweight, durable, and capable of opening completely flat on a desk. The physical form of the printed page was engineered to manage, navigate, and survive an increasing density of information. The primary demand engine for millions of these thread-bound books was the Imperial Civil Service Examination, the rigorous testing system used to select government officials. The state's enshrinement of a strict Neo-Confucian orthodoxy created a captive, guaranteed market for educational primers, for philosophical commentaries, and test manuals. Commercial publishers in the city of Jianyang capitalized on this demand. They discarded elite aesthetic standards in favor of market efficiency, printing massive volumes of cheap texts. To appeal to buyers with lower literacy levels, Jianyang publishers utilized a dual-register layout. Simple illustrations occupied the top third of the page, while the functional text was relegated to the bottom two-thirds. They also produced Wanbao Quanshu, literally complete books of 10,000 treasures. These comprehensive manuals for daily living offered commoners practical instructions on agriculture, medicine, and law. This boom gave rise to the cultural publisher, failed examination candidates who leveraged their elite classical training to edit and profit from the commercial book market. Commercial publishers hijacked the state's rigid examination apparatus to create the world's first mass-consumer print market, which transitioned reading from strict study to personal entertainment. While the commercial market thrived on unregulated chaos, the imperial state desired total ideological control and intellectual synthesis. In 1772, the Qianlong Emperor launched a comprehensive initiative to centralize this control, the Siku Quanshu, or Complete Library of the Four Treasuries. The project comprised over 36,000 volumes, aiming to capture every piece of written knowledge within the empire. This diagram illustrates the state forcing all knowledge into four rigid branches: classics, history, philosophy, and Bell's letters. However, this compilation was simultaneously a nationwide inquisition. Committees actively hunted down heterodox or anti-Manchu texts, destroying thousands of books that challenged the orthodox narrative. The Siku Quanshu demonstrates that in late imperial China, the exercise of library science and the tool of censorship were the exact same mechanism. In sharp contrast to the state's weaponized, highly visible libraries, private bibliophiles sought to protect texts from both political purges and natural decay. Established in the 1560s, the Tianyi Gay Library stands today as Asia's oldest surviving private library. It was designed as a fortress for literature. They employed strict preservation methods. They instituted family-only locks, used camphor wood against insects, and physical pools against fire. These private collectors acted as the offline backup drives of Chinese civilization, securing culture against collapsing dynasties and the destruction of imperial archives. In the 19th century, Western missionaries introduced metallic movable type optimized for Chinese characters, which shifted the physical production methods of printing. Today, the static printed page is undergoing its final morphological shift, completely transforming its physical structure into the vast interconnected digital realm. Modern artificial intelligence text recognition and GIS mapping are digitizing the remnants of these ancient libraries. GIS is a computer framework that captures and analyzes spatial data, allowing researchers to map historical locations and turn static pages into searchable, hyperlinked datasets. The technological journey has moved from the heavy bamboo slip to the flexible paper scroll to the commercial woodblock and finally to the digital database. The Chinese book served as the architecture of memory, administration, and power. Watch what happens when you heat these opaque, red cinnabar crystals. They break down into pooling drops of liquid metallic mercury. Today, we call this a chemical reduction, but in ancient China, this was the start of a 3,000-year tradition of material transformation. This was the practice of weidan, or outer alchemy. The goal was to align matter with the Tao, the fundamental governing order of the universe, by accelerating natural processes in a laboratory. To achieve that alignment, practitioners built the Chamber of Elixirs, often located in secluded mountains. At its center sat the Lu, a tiered clay stove with 8 openings on each level, symbolizing the 8 directions of the compass and providing precise airflow control. These chambers were the site of rigorous experimentation with distillation, sublimation, and thermal regulation. These techniques eventually migrated out of the alchemist's mountain retreat and into the workshops of working artisans. Before this intervention, the colors and properties of the material world were largely determined by what could be harvested directly from the landscape. By treating the world as a vibrant laboratory, Chinese artisans moved beyond the limitations of raw nature, achieving a practical mastery over the physical world. This is the terracotta army. Creating this mass-produced army required more than just clay. It required the large-scale application of advanced man-made pigments. This animation shows the synthesis of Han purple. To create this molecular lattice of barium copper silicate, artisans had to maintain a solid-state reaction at 1,000 degrees Celsius for up to 24 hours. In the kilns, potters learned to control the internal atmosphere of the fire. The vibrant red finish on this vessel comes from reduction firing. Starving the oxygen forces copper compounds into a brilliant, glassy red. Intrigued, This Junware jar appears opalescent blue, yet there is actually no blue pigment in this glaze. The color comes from liquid-liquid phase separation. As the glaze melts, microscopic glass droplets separate like oil in water. These droplets physically scatter incoming light, reflecting only blue wavelengths back to your eye. It's color produced through structural physics rather than chemistry. These ceramic techniques demonstrate a level of thermal and chemical precision that predates modern material science by centuries. In the Sichuan province, the imperial demand for salt revenue drove the development of some of the most advanced mechanical engineering in the ancient world. Using bamboo pipelines and heavy iron bits, engineers developed percussion drilling techniques to reach brine pools 100 meters deep. Once the brine was lifted to the surface, it had to be boiled in massive iron cauldrons to crystallize the salt. By 200 AD, workers had learned to siphon natural gas from these same wells. They channeled the gas through bamboo pipes to provide the thermal energy needed to boil the brine in large-scale evaporation stations. This mineral expertise supported other industries as well. In textile dyeing, metallic salts, known as mordants, like alum and ferrous sulfate, were used to lock colors into fibers, creating chemically stable bonds that resisted washing and light. These operations transformed local crafts into a centralized industrial complex, providing the economic foundation that sustained the empire. In the apothecary's workshop, the practice of Paoji involved roasting toxic minerals with honey or wine. This pharmaceutical processing was used to modify the chemical nature of substances like mercury and sulfur for medical use. Experimenters focused on the 4 yellow drugs: sulfur, realgar, orpiment, and arsenic, minerals that were central to both medicine and alchemical transformation. In the mid-9th century, alchemists mixing sulfur and saltpeter with binders like honey accidentally created a volatile compound termed huoyao, or fire medicine. Initially recorded as a warning, early texts describe how this fire medicine ignited unexpectedly, burning the experimenters' hands and faces and destroying their homes. By the 11th century, the military manual Wu Jing Zongyao recorded the first definitive gunpowder formulas. Over the next 2 centuries, the nitrate levels in these recipes rose from 12% to over 90%. This explosive tower enabled the transition from bamboo fire lances to hollow explosive shells and the heavy cast metal cannons that redefined the nature of conflict. As shown in this image, these chemical technologies, salt drilling, porcelain, and gunpowder, traveled across Eurasia via the Silk Road. By the 6th century, Chinese records of laboratory techniques, like distillation and mineral purification, were being studied by Arabic writers. Their work eventually introduced these pharmaceutical and metallurgical methods to medieval Europe, forming the basis of early modern chemistry. This tradition of material transformation culminated in 1965, when Chinese researchers achieved the world's first total synthesis of crystalline bovine insulin, a functional protein created entirely from scratch in a laboratory. The transition from cinnabar elixirs to synthetic proteins represents 3 millennia of continuity. The magic of transformation was never an accident of craft, but the result of a rigorous, alternative vision of the natural world. Thanks for watching. If you want to explore how ancient technology shaped our world, then hit subscribe. Before the invention of the compass, navigating the open ocean was an exercise in terrifying vulnerability. Sailors plotted their courses by tracking the sun during the day and the constellations at night. But when heavy storm clouds rolled in, that celestial map vanished, leaving crews entirely blind. Disorientation on the open water frequently resulted in lost ships and massive casualties. The solution to this problem came from Chinese scholars, who discovered a way to harness an invisible force radiating from the Earth itself. That discovery began with lodestone, a naturally occurring magnetic mineral made of magnetite. As early as the Warring States period, around the 4th century BC, Chinese observers documented this stone's ability to attract iron. They took this raw lodestone and carved it into the shape of a spoon or ladle, representing the constellation of the Great Bear. When placed on a flat bronze divination plate, The handle of the spoon would consistently rotate to point south. This instrument was called the Sinan. The Sinan was used strictly on land. It was a geomantic tool used for feng shui, the ancient practice of orienting buildings, orienting sacred tombs, and grand palaces, to align with the natural forces of the environment. As you can see in this physics model, a heavy stone ladle resting on a bronze plate requires a perfectly smooth, level surface to overcome its own friction. The slightest tilt of a ship's deck or a single grain of sand would abruptly halt its rotation. It was too unstable for the conditions of a long sea voyage. To make this technology portable, engineers needed to ditch the heavy stone. By the 11th century, during the Song dynasty, Chinese metallurgists figured out how to artificially magnetize lightweight iron. Looking at the internal cross-section of this iron fish, you can see the mechanics of thermoremanence. Blacksmiths heated a piece of iron past its Curie point, the temperature where a metal loses its permanent magnetic properties, and then rapidly quenched it in water while holding it in a north-south alignment. The chaotic internal magnetic domains locked into a uniform, parallel pattern, absorbing the Earth's magnetic signature. The military adopted this technique, forging thin, lightweight pieces of magnetized iron in the shape of fish. These could be floated in small bowls of water to orient moving troops during dark or overcast weather. While the iron fish solved the weight issue, it introduced a new problem: water displacement. A liquid suspension on a moving cart or a pitching ship makes the floating indicator erratic and difficult to read with precision. The next hurdle was cleared by an 11th century astronomer and polymath named Shen Kuo. In his 1088 text, The Dream Pool Essays, he documented a systematic study of magnetic properties. Shen Kuo found he could create a stronger magnetic charge by repeatedly rubbing a lightweight steel needle directly against a raw lodestone. To isolate that tiny needle from the friction of a hard surface or the sloshing of water, Shen Kuo applied a microscopic drop of wax to its exact center and suspended it from a single, freshly spun thread of silk. Isolating the needle from surface friction or liquid movement provided the stability needed for precise measurement. The compass had become a sensitive scientific instrument. That sensitivity immediately revealed a strange anomaly. Once the needle was suspended perfectly, Shen Kuo noticed it never pointed exactly true south. It consistently settled slightly to the east. As this rotating Earth model illustrates, Shen Kuo had discovered magnetic declination. The Earth's magnetic poles, where the compass actually points, do not perfectly align with the planet's geographic axis of rotation. There is a measurable tilt between the two. Identifying this specific mathematical deviation was critical. A slight angular error might not matter over a few miles of land, but over hundreds of miles of open ocean, ignoring magnetic declination would cause a navigator to miss their intended port. Armed with an accurate needle and an understanding of its deviations, Chinese mariners took the compass to the sea. The 1119 text, Pingzhou Table Talks, provides the first uncontestable record of sailors relying on a water-suspended magnetic needle to navigate through severe storms. Looking closely at the center, you see the floating magnetic needle of the Luopan. As we pull back, notice how the needle is surrounded by concentric rings of Chinese characters, plotting 24 distinct directional points, allowing navigators to calculate exact, repeatable nautical bearings. By combining the magnetized needle with this 24-point mathematical grid, navigators were able to map specific, repeatable trade routes rather than guessing their general direction. This view of a dense harbor illustrates the scale of China's maritime power. By the 15th century, Admiral Zhang He used these compasses to guide massive treasure fleets on multi-leg routes across the Indian Ocean to Africa's coast. As Chinese fleets reached new regions, the technology diffused westward. Arab merchants adopted the compass and transferred the knowledge to Europe by the late 12th century. European modifications, such as the dry pivot compass, eventually provided the reliability necessary for long-range voyages into the Atlantic and Pacific. The technical refinement of the magnetic needle turned the open ocean into a calculated network of trade routes. This technology provided the physical framework for the global maritime networks that followed. To understand ancient China, you have to look past the philosophy and warfare and look directly at the dirt, the water, and the infrastructure. The region's geography presented a brutal reality. State survival depended on managing massive, volatile river systems that regularly threatened the densely populated agricultural basins below. While Western engineering historically relied on rigid dams that try to stop water and fail catastrophically, Chinese engineers developed dynamic hydraulic systems designed to guide natural forces rather than block them. Their engineering became the physical embodiment of intense social coordination and empirical physics, scaling base materials like earth, bamboo, and stone into empire-sustaining macrostructures. Because of the sheer scale of the empire, these were never isolated inventions. They were self-sustaining intergenerational systems necessary to keep a civilization alive. Look at this artificial peninsula splitting the fast-moving river. This is the Dujiangyan irrigation system, designed by the engineer Li Bing in 256 BC, and it has been operating continuously for 2,268 years without a single dam. This 3D topographical map shows how that peninsula, the Fishmouth Levee, utilizes the shifting of streamlines. Instead of stopping the river, it automatically divides the Minjiang into an inner channel and an outer channel, maintaining a precise 40 to 60 water volume split, depending on the season. But dividing the water introduces an existential threat: sediment buildup. In undammed networks, heavy silt usually accumulates and destroys the irrigation channels within a few decades. Li Bing solved this using the physics of fluid dynamics. As the river bends toward the inner bottleneck channel, centrifugal force pushes the heavier, bottom-dwelling sediment outward. 90% of that heavy silt washes over a secondary spillway called the flying sand weir, leaving only clean surface water to flow into the agricultural plains. By working with fluid dynamics rather than against them, the engineers created a perpetual, self-flushing infrastructure that outperforms static barriers to this day. Once the water was controlled, it had to be navigated. This image shows the density of traditional boats on the Grand Canal, the vital circulatory system that moved grain from the fertile southern regions to power the political centers in the north. Moving thousands of tons of cargo across varying elevations meant ships had to navigate steep drops. Older flash locks simply opened a single gate, creating a violent, dangerous rush of water that damaged ships and drained the canal's baseline water supply. As this 3D model shows, in 984 AD, an engineer named Chao Weiyu solved this by inventing the double-gate pound lock. It is an enclosed chamber built directly into the canal, an innovation that predates European equivalents by 400 years. The mechanical steps are precise. A ship enters, the first gate seals the chamber, and water is pumped in or drained out to equalize the level with the next elevation. The ship then safely transits through the second gate without losing the canal's overall water pressure. The pound lock converted unpredictable rivers into a standardized transport grid, governed by precise mathematical increments. Look at the shallow curve and the empty circular cutouts on the shoulders of this structure. This is the Jiazhou Bridge, constructed by Li Chun in 605 AD, representing a radical departure in civil architecture. This structural load simulation illustrates the mechanics of the 83-degree segmental arch. Unlike the steep Roman model, this shallow design directs downward force vectors outward to the abutments, increasing the structure's overall stability. Those smaller, symmetrical arches built into the sides, known as an open spandrel design, serve a dual function. They drastically reduce the material weight of the bridge, and they act as relief valves for intense hydraulic pressure during seasonal floods, allowing excess water to pass directly through the structure. Extending this logic to fortification, the builders of the Great Wall integrated sophisticated material science into their construction. This microscopic view shows the chemistry of Ming Dynasty sticky rice mortar. Organic amylopectin molecules from the rice weave into and bind with inorganic calcium carbonate crystals. This chemical reaction creates a dense bioceramic matrix that is highly flexible and earthquake-resistant. Chinese construction optimized for organic flexibility and resilience under stress, rather than sheer rigidity. That material chemistry explains the deep longevity of their structures. That exact same material ingenuity drove heavy industry. This image shows the dense cluster of towering A-frame wooden and bamboo derricks rising above the rooftops in Sichuan, the heart of a massive ancient salt industry. To extract brine, miners developed percussive drilling. Instead of using rigid pipes, they used flexible bamboo cables to repeatedly drop a heavy iron bit. By violently and repeatedly smashing down into cracked bedrock, they reached depths exceeding 1,000 meters. Drilling that deep introduced an extreme hazard, striking highly pressurized pockets of volatile natural gas alongside the liquid brine. This cross-section shows the cane pen drum, an early multi-phase separator that engineers invented to prevent explosions at the wellhead. As the mixture enters the wooden drum, liquid brine drops into one output pipe, while the lighter natural gas rises into a separate output pipe. They captured that natural gas and routed it through miles of sealed bamboo pipelines directly to the boiling stoves, using the Earth's own fuel to evaporate the brine and harvest the salt. This was a proto-industrial revolution, highly complex chemical extraction and fluid separation, achieved entirely with organic, pre-modern materials. The capacity to build towering derricks and massive canals eventually scaled down into micromechanical precision, peaking with Su Song's astronomical clock tower in 1094 AD. This 3D exploded view reveals the world's first continuous power transmitting chain drive, rotating a large central wheel to track the stars. A hydromechanical escapement regulates this motion. As water buckets fill, the escapement trips the gears, converting continuous liquid flow into precise, ticking intervals. This mechanical ingenuity permeated daily life, manifesting in agricultural tools like the Lush multi-tube seed drill and the stern post rudder for precise naval steering. Precision mechanical engineering directly scaled the empire's efficiency by automating its agriculture, its navigation, and its state timekeeping. The persistence of these megastructures relies on a formalized social protocol of maintenance. Engineering was not just the act of building, but the commitment to ongoing upkeep. Look at these workers performing manual labor to dig and move wet sand from the riverbank. Dynasties enforced strict renovation rules, like the annual dredging at Duzhangyang, guided by the instruction, harnessing shoals deep, building dams low. As trade expanded, concepts like the pound lock, the seed drill, and percussive drilling flowed outward across the Silk Road and maritime trade routes, laying the mechanical groundwork for other civilizations. Ancient Chinese engineering proves that advanced civilization building doesn't require modern steel or concrete. It requires a rigorous systems thinking approach, a keen observation of natural forces, and the ability to coordinate human effort across centuries. When your entire society is collapsing into violent, endless warfare, abstract questions about the nature of truth lose their appeal. The only question that matters is how you survive. That was the reality during the decline of the Zhou dynasty, leading into a brutal era appropriately named the Warring States period. Over 2.5 centuries, 7 major Chinese states fought a continuous, bloody struggle for dominance. While early Western philosophers like Plato were focused heavily on epistemology, the theoretical study of how we know what we know, ancient Chinese thinkers were forced to be pragmatic. They desperately searched for the way, a practical method to stop the slaughter and restore social order. This intense pressure cooker of violence produced the 100 schools of thought. Scholars traveled from state to state, carrying heavy rolls of bamboo slips, offering rival kings different intellectual blueprints for peace. The foundational ideas of Chinese philosophy emerged directly from the mud and blood of the battlefield. They were emergency cures designed for a civilization in total crisis. The first major cure came from Confucius. He argued that a harmonious society is simply a macro version of a well-ordered family. If children respect their parents and parents care for their children, you can scale that exact same dynamic up to citizens and rulers. To make this work, Confucianism introduced a radical concept, meritocracy. Instead of handing power to aristocrats based on their bloodline, leadership roles should be earned by those who passed rigorous examinations in ethics and statecraft. A philosopher named Mosey looked at the same chaos and diagnosed a completely different root cause. He argued the violence was a symptom of partiality, the human tendency to love our own family or tribe at the expense of everyone else. The Maoist solution was universal care, insisting that a stranger deserves the exact same compassion as a sibling. And they didn't just preach this equality. Maoists were highly skilled engineers who actively traveled to smaller, besieged states to build massive defensive walls and protect the weak from invasion. Both of these schools tried to engineer social harmony from the top down, but they pulled in opposite directions. Confucianism relied on enforcing strict family hierarchies, while Maoism demanded a radical universal equality. Taoism rejected all of these rigid social rules. Taoists argued that human interference was the actual cause of the chaos. Their cure was aligning with the Tao, a term meaning the way, representing the unnameable natural order of the universe. This requires the practice of wu wei, or effortless action. Rather than forcing outcomes through strict laws, you flow around obstacles like water, yielding to the natural balance of opposing forces. On the absolute opposite end of the spectrum was legalism. This school operated on a ruthless, pragmatic assumption. Human nature is inherently selfish, and people are entirely immune to moralizing. The legalist method required absolute control. The state maintained order through strict laws, guaranteed rewards for obedience, and harsh, immediate punishments for any dissent. By embracing this unforgiving system, the Qin state successfully crushed its rivals and unified China. Within a few centuries, Chinese thinkers had mapped out a complete spectrum of governance, ranging from the total natural freedom of Taoism to the absolute authoritarian control of legalism. Over the next millennium, these competing schools cross-pollinated. During the Song and Ming dynasties, they blended into Neo-Confucianism, a broader framework that combined Confucian ethics with Taoist and Buddhist metaphysics. Out of this synthesis came the philosopher Wang Yongming, who proposed a core principle, the unity of knowledge and action. He argued that you cannot separate the mind from the body's behavior. If you claim to know what is right, but you fail to actually do it in reality, you do not possess that knowledge at all. Chinese philosophy ultimately demands that intellectual realization cannot stay trapped in your head. It must always manifest as physical, practical action in the real world. This map of imperial China highlights the vast civil service examination system. Built on Confucian meritocracy, it organized the empire by testing administrators on ethical and practical knowledge. As trade expanded, these concepts traveled westward, inspiring the modern, merit-based civil service models organizing Western governments. The legacy of these ideas extends deeply into the internal world, too. The Taoist and Buddhist emphasis on accepting the present moment without judgment eventually became the exact foundation for modern clinical mindfulness. Today, Western psychological frameworks rely heavily on these ancient principles. Gestalt therapy, which focuses on experiencing the present rather than analyzing the past, and acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT, which treats suffering by teaching patients to stop fighting reality, both operate on the premise that separating your mind from your physical presence causes mental distress. A famous artistic allegory called The Vinegar Tasters captures this perfectly. It shows three masters dipping their fingers in a vat of vinegar. Confucius tasted as sour, meaning life requires rules and corrections. The Buddha tasted as bitter, viewing life as rooted in suffering. But Laozi, the founder of Taoism, smiles. To him, the vinegar is inherently sweet, because reality is perfect exactly as it is. From engineering the bureaucracy of modern states to treating clinical anxiety, Chinese philosophy serves as an enduring, highly practical toolkit for living harmoniously in an unpredictably chaotic world. Modern linear algebra relies on the matrix, a rectangular grid of numbers used to solve systems of equations. While often attributed to 19th century European scholars like Carl Friedrich Gauss, the logic of the matrix has much older roots. More than 1700 years before Gauss, Chinese mathematicians were using this exact grid-based method to solve equations with up to 6 unknowns. This tradition was carried out by the Chaoren, a class of hereditary state officials responsible for the daily functioning of the imperial bureaucracy. These officials used mathematics as a standardized tool for state administration, turning complex calculations into repeatable procedures used to manage a vast empire. Tax collection required immense logistical precision. Under the fair levy system, officials calculated grain taxes by weighing a region's population and its distance to the capital against the local cost of crops. Engineering the 200-mile Grand Canal demanded similarly rigorous data. Success depended on calculating the exact volume of earth to be displaced and the precise food provisions needed for the thousands of men performing mandatory corvée labor. Beyond the earth, the Chao Ren tracked the heavens. They monitored the sun, moon, and stars to produce the precise calendars that dictated the planting and harvesting cycles of an agrarian society. In a culture where the emperor's authority was tied to the harmony of the cosmos, these mathematical records provided the administrative proof of a stable and well-ordered reign. This grid, the counting board, was the hardware of Chinese mathematics. Officials used bamboo counting rods to perform rapid calculations. Arranged in a grid, they formed a decimal place value system by the 4th century BCE. A blank square represented 0, efficiently depicting massive numbers. When using these boards to solve complex matrix equations, mathematicians frequently encountered deficits, quantities that fell below 0 during the calculation process. To track these values, they used a color-coded system, red rods for positive quantities and black rods for negative ones. This allowed them to perform subtraction and balance accounts with a level of rigor that would not appear in Europe for over a millennium. The physical layout of the counting board shaped the way these scholars thought, making abstract algebraic concepts visible and easy to manipulate. The most influential record of these methods is the 9 chapters on the mathematical art. It was a practical handbook containing hundreds of problems on everything from surveying to fair taxation. In 263 CE, the mathematician Liu Hui wrote a commentary on the text that provided the logical principles behind its procedures. He moved beyond simple instructions to explain the underlying logic of the math itself. Liu Hui approximated pi by inscribing a polygon within a circle. Doubling its sides to 3072 yielded unprecedented precision. Later, Zhu Chongji used this method to calculate pi to 7 decimal places, a world record lasting a millennium. This drive for precision was fueled by the state's need for perfect astronomical and engineering data, leading Chinese mathematicians to some of the most accurate approximations in history. By the 13th century, during the Song and Yuan dynasties, Chinese mathematics reached a peak of algebraic complexity. Mathematicians perfected a method called Tianyuan Shu, the method of the celestial unknown. This allowed them to solve high-degree polynomial equations using positional arrays on the counting board. They also mapped out the patterns of binomial coefficients in a triangular layout. This diagram appeared in Chinese texts centuries before the same pattern was described in Europe as Pascal's triangle. By the year 1300, China possessed a sophisticated algebraic system capable of handling multiple variables and complex series that would not be understood in the West for hundreds of years. Ancient Greek mathematics focused on an axiomatic model, seeking to prove immutable truths through pure geometry. In contrast, the Chinese tradition was built on algorithms. It focused on creating efficient, repeatable procedures to solve the tangible problems of a functioning state. This ancient focus on finding the most efficient procedure for a specific result represents an early mastery of the same logic we use today to process information. While the Greek model taught us how to prove that a statement is true, the Chinese model provided the early foundations for the algorithmic logic that defines modern computing. When we picture ancient metalworking, we usually imagine a solitary blacksmith pounding a glowing piece of iron on an anvil. But in ancient China, metal wasn't something you hit. It was a liquid. You poured it. By treating metal as a fluid, Chinese foundries achieved liquid-state iron casting roughly 2,000 years before European metalworkers managed to do the same. Instead of spending days heating and striking a single iron bloom to shape it, Chinese artisans engineered complex molds. They melted the metal down completely and let gravity do the work. You can see the result of this fluid approach in artifacts from the Shang dynasty. Look at the continuous curves and exaggerated protrusions on this bronze vessel. These fluid, unbroken shapes are virtually impossible to create with a hammer. This conceptual shift, viewing metal as a liquid rather than a solid, allowed China to bypass the limitations of muscle power, scaling production to meet the logistical demands of an entire empire. This mastery of liquid metal actually began in the dirt. Long before they melted bronze, ancient Chinese artisans spent thousands of years perfecting high-temperature pottery kilns, learning how to control immense heat and shape clay. They applied that ceramic expertise directly to metallurgy through a technique called piece mold casting. Piece mold casting is a method where craftsmen carve a design into a segmented clay outer shell that fits perfectly over a solid clay inner core. Artisans surrounded an inner clay core with carved blocks, creating a negative space. Molten bronze flowed down a funnel, filling every millimeter to capture the exact impression. But the rigid mold had to be completely destroyed to extract the metal. Every vessel was an original. Despite that constraint, this ingenious modular clay process allowed for staggering scale. Artisans could cast massive, thick-legged tripod cauldrons covered in intricate geometric surface details simply by piecing together larger clay shells. Piece mold casting proved that complex, large-scale metal objects could be produced using a systematic, modular logic. It established a highly efficient, factory-like workflow that ultimately set the stage for the next great leap in metallurgy. By the Han Dynasty, the government realized that metal was a strategic asset. To supply a massive, expanding civilian population, the state established a strict monopoly over iron production. To meet demand, the Han utilized the blast furnace. Workers drop iron ore and carbon into the top, while a water-powered bellows injects oxygen below. This drives temperatures to 1200 degrees, producing a continuous flow of liquid iron that fills identical modular molds. We can see the results of this mass production in agricultural implements. The durable iron blade components affixed to this ancient wooden plow are standardized cast iron parts, designed to help farmers break up densely packed soil. By prioritizing millions of low-cost plows over a few elite swords, the state-run blast furnace directly increased crop yields. This steady supply of cast iron firm tools fueled a massive expansion of the empire's population. Cast iron was highly efficient to produce, but it had a severe limitation. It contained up to 4% carbon, making it incredibly brittle and likely to shatter if it took a heavy impact. To solve this, Chinese metallurgists invented the chaogong, or stir-frying process. Chaogong is a fining technique where an artisan vigorously stirs a pool of molten cast iron in an open hearth, exposing it to the air. As the liquid iron churns, the oxygen in the air reacts with the metal and burns off the excess carbon. By precisely controlling how much carbon burned away, they transformed that brittle cast iron into a highly durable, versatile steel that could hold a sharp edge and withstand a heavy blow. With the chaogong process, ancient China integrated a three-part material system: bronze for ritual, cast iron for widespread agriculture, and steel for infrastructure and defense. This map tracks the global timeline of cast iron. The production node activates in China around the 5th century BC. You have to wait nearly 2 millennia before a similar European node activates in the 14th century AD. That historical head start allowed Chinese administrators to engineer entire societies. They cultivated vast tracts of land with iron plowshares, equipped massive armies, and built the infrastructure of an enduring empire. The strength of ancient China's metallurgy came from the administrative and thermal logic that treated metal as a liquid to be managed, rather than a solid to be fought. It was a system that transformed raw earth into the durable foundations of an empire. Before the invention of paper, governing an empire required heavy lifting. Chinese officials recorded taxes, laws, and military logistics on strips of wood and bamboo. For a single day of reading, an emperor might sift through 100 pounds of these bound slips. When a finalized report was slammed onto a desk, it took up physical space and required serious effort to transport. The introduction of paper erased that friction. Information transitioned from a heavy, localized object to a near-weightless, portable medium. Moving from carved bone and bamboo to lightweight sheets redefined how a vast state could operate. It allowed complex data to travel hundreds of miles in a courier saddlebag, expanding both the reach of the government and the boundaries of who could realistically access written knowledge. During the Han Dynasty, bureaucrats used this newfound portability to scale up their administration. They dispatched detailed census forms, tracked regional tax records, and coordinated military supply lines across thousands of miles of varied terrain. Religious groups recognized the value of this cheap, easily reproducible material immediately. Buddhist monks and Taoist priests began mass copying sutras and protective talismans, accelerating the spread of their teachings to ordinary citizens far beyond the major temples. This administrative scaling peaked during the Song Dynasty with the civil service examinations. Because standardized paper tests could be distributed and graded uniformly, candidates from any province could study the exact same texts and compete for high-ranking government positions. Power was no longer strictly inherited through aristocratic bloodlines. The empire relied instead on a sprawling bureaucracy managed by a new class of scholar officials whose authority came entirely from their mastery of written, widely accessible texts. While crude forms of poured paper had been made as early as the 2nd century BCE, the process was inconsistent. In 105 AD, a Han court official named Kai Lun standardized the recipe into a reliable manufacturing process. Kai Lun developed a dipping method. He took cheap, discarded materials, like the bark of the mulberry tree, hemp waste, cloth rags, and fishing nets, and he beat them thoroughly in a large stone mortar until they completely broke down into a thick, watery slurry. Crushing these plants and textiles isolates their cellulose fibers, the microscopic strands providing structural strength for plant walls. When a screen is lifted from the vat, these fibers tangle and bond as water drains, forming a durable, interlocking web that holds ink without bleeding. Unlike earlier methods where pulp was poured unevenly onto a stationary mold, this dipping technique produced smooth, consistent sheets. It also relied entirely on highly abundant waste materials, engineering a process suited for limitless mass production. By converting literal societal garbage into a reliable vehicle for information, Kai Lun removed the empire's greatest bottleneck to communication. By the time of the Tang Dynasty, the demand for books, calendars, and agricultural manuals outpaced what individual scribes could copy by hand. This pressure drove the invention of xylography, commonly known as woodblock printing. The process started with a scribe writing the text on a sheet of thin, nearly transparent paper. This sheet was pasted face down onto a smooth block of wild pear wood, leaving the ink clearly visible in reverse. An artisan would then meticulously cut away the negative space around the strokes. This left the mirrored characters in raised relief, ready to catch the ink and transfer it to a fresh sheet of paper. Dated to 868, this Buddhist Diamond Sutra is the world's oldest surviving dated printed book. Its highly refined, sharp vertical columns perfectly capture the complex strokes of the Chinese logographic script, a system where thousands of characters represent entire concepts. Woodblock printing broke the monopoly of the handwritten manuscript. By the 16th century, the cost of a book had dropped by nearly 90%, allowing the exact same information to be distributed identically to thousands of readers. Woodblocks had a major limitation. If a carver made a single mistake, the entire board had to be scrapped. Furthermore, a carved block was static. It could only ever be used to print one specific page. In the 11th century, artisan B. Sheng developed a solution. Instead of carving a whole page, he sculpted individual characters out of sticky clay, making them as thin as the edge of a coin, and baked them in a fire until they were hard. To print a page, he arranged these loose characters inside an iron frame resting on a metal plate. The plate was coated with a mixture of pine resin and wax. When heated, the mixture melted, and as it cooled, it locked the precise grid of characters firmly in place. This was the world's first movable type system, yet it didn't immediately replace the woodblock in China. To print even a standard text, a shop needed to manufacture and organize tens of thousands of unique clay pieces for the massive logographic alphabet. Because of that linguistic hurdle, woodblocks remained the dominant method in East Asia for centuries. Mechanically, however, Bai Sheng successfully engineered the conceptual framework for movable type 400 years before it appeared in Europe. While movable type waited for the right alphabet to maximize its efficiency, paper itself was moving westward. Carried by merchants, diplomats, and monks traveling the Silk Road, the physical sheets, and eventually the knowledge of how to make them, began to spread. A major transfer of this knowledge occurred in 751 CE, following the Battle of Talas. Chinese artisans captured by the Abbasid Caliphate introduced the papermaking process to the Islamic world, where it quickly replaced parchment and papyrus as the standard for administration. Back in China, the technology grew so advanced that the government used it to issue the world's first paper fiat currency, money backed entirely by the state. To prevent counterfeiting, these banknotes relied on official stamps and intricate borders that were exceptionally difficult to replicate. This technology provided the Islamic world and later European states with a standard medium for management. It turned complex tasks, like administering a caliphate or issuing national currency, into a process of standardized ink and pulp. When the combined technologies of paper and the concept of movable type eventually reached Europe, they found an environment with a small 26-letter alphabet. This provided the exact material conditions Johannes Gutenberg needed to build his printing press in the 1440s. By dropping the cost of reproduction, printed paper fueled a surge in global literacy. It enabled the distribution of classical texts during the European Renaissance and allowed scholars to share peer-reviewed data during the scientific revolution. The methods developed to manage a sprawling bureaucracy and mass-produce sacred texts reached far beyond the Chinese border. They established the specific material conditions, standardized paper, and reusable type that eventually allowed for the global distribution of human knowledge. In the West, we view the writer as an outsider, a voice apart from the state. But in ancient China, the greatest poets, the meticulous historians, and the highest-ranking government officials were very often the exact same person. This deep integration created a continuous 3,000-year written record. By volume alone, the surviving Chinese literary archive is likely larger than the rest of the world's national literatures combined. These characters originated for royal divination. Priests carved questions into bone, applied heat, and read the resulting cracks as a direct dialogue with the cosmos. This gave rise to the concept of wen, a term that captures both a written pattern and the essence of culture itself. In this context, writing served as the essential organizing force of the civilization, intended to align human society with the order of the universe. This reverence for the word reached its peak in the Keiju. For 1,300 years, this imperial examination system served as a meritocracy, selecting the bureaucracy based on their mastery of literature rather than inherited bloodlines. To hold office, a candidate had to memorize thousands of characters on texts like these bamboo slips. Mastery meant the ability to compose complex poetry, craft persuasive prose, and apply Confucian philosophy to modern political problems. The scholar's tools, the brush, paper, ink, and inkstone, were known as the four treasures of the study. A candidate's calligraphy was viewed as a physical extension of their internal discipline, with the brushstroke itself serving as a record of their moral character. The infrastructure for these tests was immense. During exam season, thousands of candidates from across the empire locked themselves into identical brick cells, living and writing for days at a time. While the passing rate was often less than 1%, the system succeeded in creating a unified literary mind. It ensured that every official, no matter how distant their province, shared a single cultural and ethical vocabulary. The early masters established the link between writing and moral duty. In the 3rd century BCE, the exiled minister Kuo Yuan composed the Chu Chi, or Songs of Chu. His verse defined a legacy of the loyal scholar who uses poetry to navigate political tragedy and personal banishment. A century later, Sima Qian, the grand historian, faced a brutal choice. Having angered the emperor, he was sentenced to either execution or a life of social disgrace through castration. Sima Qian chose to live in shame for one reason. He needed to complete his Shiji, or Records of the Grand Historian. His choice redefined Chinese literature as an act of ultimate resilience, a way for the truth of the past to outlive the whims of monarchs. These figures ensured that the written word became a sacred obligation. It was the only force capable of delivering a final judgment that survived long after the author's own suffering. During the Tang Dynasty, from the 7th to the 10th centuries, poetry became the primary social and political currency of the elite. This was the Golden Age, an era where the ability to compose verse was a requirement for any person of status. The period was defined by two distinct voices. Li Bai wrote with a Taoist spontaneity, celebrating wine, solitude, and the grandeur of nature. His contemporary Du Fu used strict, regulated verse to document the human cost of the An Lushan rebellion, creating a poetic history of his age. This statue depicts Su Shi, a master of the Song dynasty. A brilliant writer, painter, and statesman, Su Shi spent much of his career in a cycle of high office followed by remote political exile. Despite his setbacks, Su Shi used literature to find joy in the mundane. While banished, he wrote about the beauty of the moon, the philosophy of a river cliff, and even the simple pleasure of cooking pork, maintaining an optimistic spirit through his art. For these poets, verse provided a psychological survival kit. It allowed them to maintain their sense of self amidst the deadly, shifting tides of court politics. Look closely at the individually carved characters on this wooden printing block. This technology supported a major cultural shift during the Ming and Qing dynasties, the move from elite classical poetry toward massive works of popular fiction. This period saw the rise of the four great classical novels. These epics, spanning hundreds of chapters, combined historical military strategy with deep mythology and the intricate psychological drama of family life. This figure here is the famous Monkey King from Journey to the West. This narrative wove Buddhist and Taoist themes into a fantastical, rebellious epic, creating characters that remain iconic in the modern world. And these novels democratized the literary mind. They took the intellectual power once reserved for the scholar's studio and moved it into the tea houses and marketplaces of the empire. This map illustrates the Sinosphere. For centuries, Chinese literature and its writing system served as the lingua franca for Japan, Korea, and Vietnam. This shared foundation exported a common administrative structure and deep Confucian values, providing a unified intellectual framework for very different nations. Today, that legacy is visible in global pop culture. Epics like Romance of the Three Kingdoms and Journey to the West have directly inspired massive video game franchises, anime, and cinematic adaptations worldwide. Even in the digital age, the act of writing characters remains a revered art form, a living expression of inner cultivation that connects the modern hand to a 3,000-year-old tradition. The Chinese literary tradition demonstrates that a civilization built on the written word can outlast its own emperors, connecting hearts and minds across millennia, borders, and new media. In 2002, archaeologists at the Loggia site in northwestern China unearthed an overturned ceramic bowl buried beneath 3 meters of sediment. An earthquake, followed by a catastrophic flood, had sealed the vessel inside an airtight pocket of mud for 4,000 years. Inside that bowl were perfectly preserved, thin yellow strands, measuring over 1/2 meter long. They were noodles, the oldest ever discovered, proving that complex dough processing existed in Asia long before wheat-based pastas appeared in the West. Analysis of the starch revealed a biochemical surprise. These noodles were made from foxtail and broomcorn millet. Unlike wheat, millet lacks the gluten proteins necessary for elasticity. Stretching these granular seeds into long, continuous strands required a highly specific, labor-intensive mechanical process. Kijia farmers manipulated the physical properties of their harvest, synthesizing new food forms from seeds that were previously only boiled or ground. Early Chinese civilization faced a severe geographic challenge. Between the arid northern plains and the tropical south, only about 10% of the land was arable, leaving the population vulnerable to extreme climate shifts. Because of the constant threat of famine, the state could not rely on passive farming. Food production had to be managed as a continuous engineering problem, requiring massive interventions in the landscape. Long-term survival for an empire of this scale demanded significant leaps in both macro infrastructure and microbiology. On the macro scale, the Duzhongyan irrigation system was built to secure the food supply. Instead of mechanical pumps, engineers hewed an artificial channel through solid rock to split the river, using gravity to divert floodwaters into the dry plain. This reliable water supply enabled the expansion of human-engineered wet field agriculture. During the Song dynasty, farmers cultivated champa rice, a resilient species imported from Southeast Asia that altered the agricultural output of the South. Champa rice was drought-resistant and matured quickly. This allowed farmers to achieve double or even triple harvests in a single year, providing the caloric surplus needed to double the country's population. While the South optimized rice, the North optimized milling. Around 400 BC, the rotary quern was introduced. Two stones rotated together to grind grain continuously. This simple but revolutionary mechanism allowed heavy crops like wheat to be processed into fine flour at a massive industrial scale. Once macro-engineering solved the problem of caloric volume, innovators turned their focus inward, refining the digestibility and nutritional efficiency of their ingredients. The soybean was the ultimate target for this refinement. Raw soybeans are high in protein and rich in calcium, but contain complex sugars that make them indigestible and unpleasantly bitter. Processing the bean through coagulation made its nutrients accessible, starting by grinding beans into thick liquid. By adding calcium salts from impure brine to the liquid, cooks triggered a reaction that binds the proteins into a digestible, firm curd called tofu. To unlock deeper nutrition, aspergillus mold is added to wheat and soybeans. Its enzymes act like microscopic scissors, breaking complex proteins into amino acids. Next, the mixture is submerged in salt brine, where yeasts synthesize new molecules, releasing glutamic acid, the chemical source of umami. This biochemical process was scaled up using massive arrays of ceramic jars to produce soy sauce. This allowed the state to extend the life of scarce salt resources while providing a stable, high-protein seasoning for the entire population. By mastering the cultivation of molds and yeasts, China engineered new protein sources that could sustain massive cities when animal meat was scarce. These same principles of stabilization were applied to tea. Originally consumed as a boiled medicinal soup, tea leaves were eventually compressed into dense blocks to ensure they remained stable during long-distance trade. During the Ming Dynasty, production shifted from steaming leaves to roasting them rapidly in a hot wok. This thermal processing served a specific purpose. The high heat deactivates the enzymes in the leaf. This instantly halts oxidation, preserving the plant's flavor and preventing the grassy odor associated with older steaming methods. This chemical mastery over the leaf created a shelf-stable product that became a global commodity, eventually reorganizing the global economy around its export. These resilient, processed foods traveled via the Silk Road and maritime trade routes, permanently influencing the culinary structures of neighboring cultures and eventually reaching the West. This entire system was governed by the nutritional balance of fan and chai. Fan provides the energy-giving grain base, while chai provides the nutrient-dense accompaniments, ensuring that every meal was a balanced delivery system for human health. Today, as the world looks for sustainable, plant-based proteins, modern gastronomy is returning to these ancient methods. The steam-filled markets of modern China are the living legacy of these early experiments. Chinese cuisine is not just a collection of regional recipes, it is a 5,000-year-old system of biological and chemical engineering, built for the scale of survival. You wake up, brush your teeth with a bristle toothbrush, check the time on your mechanical watch, and grab a paper bill for coffee. Every single one of those objects was invented in ancient China. When we picture Chinese history, we usually visualize massive imperial structures built to project authority and enforce borders. A giant stone wall is visually commanding, but it rarely alters how a normal person eats, communicates, or navigates their daily life. Real societal transformation happens from the bottom up. It is engineered by the invisible, highly practical tools that dictate how a species lives day to day. Writing on bamboo slips and heavy wooden boards was incredibly cumbersome. During the Han Dynasty, court officials solved this friction by crushing tree bark, linen rags, and fishing nets to create the first high-quality writing paper. Because this new material was cheap to produce and lightweight, it solved a cascade of logistical problems. Carrying thousands of metal coins for large transactions was heavy and impractical. By the Tang Dynasty, merchants simply swapped the metal for printed paper, creating the world's first paper currency. A few centuries later, during the Song Dynasty, a boom in international trade brought an influx of foreign merchants into Chinese cities. To help these travelers order food without speaking the local language, restaurants began handing them sheets of paper listing the available dishes, the first menus. Paper quickly found its way into highly personal spaces. The royal family adopted soft fabric paper for personal hygiene, giving us early toilet paper. They also began pasting large hand-painted sheets onto their walls for insulation and interior design, inventing wallpaper. A simple engineering solution for taking notes evolved into the quiet infrastructure of global commerce and domestic life. At the Lajia archaeological site in Qinghai province, an overturned ceramic bowl preserved slender, yellow strands made from millet dough for 4,000 years. These are the oldest physical noodles ever discovered. And while chopsticks are universally associated with East Asian dining, Chinese diners were also using bone forks thousands of years before the utensil reached European tables. To produce enough millet and wheat to feed an exploding population, engineers had to scale up from delicate kitchen implements to heavy machinery. During the Han Dynasty, laborers began using a new type of cart. By placing one massive wheel directly under the load rather than at the front, the weight was transferred entirely off the user's arms and onto the axle, multiplying the amount of cargo a single person could move. To prepare the fields for planting, an inventor developed the moldboard plow, a tool that made it possible to till along the natural contours of steep hillsides without causing severe soil erosion. This diagram shows a cross-section of the moldboard plow in action. It features a central sharp point to cut the earth and curved iron wings that push the dirt aside. This specific geometry drastically reduces friction as it moves through the soil. These calculated empirical improvements in farming and transport allowed early Chinese civilizations to consistently produce enough caloric surplus to sustain massive, dense urban populations. These inventions are rarely associated with their Chinese creators today, even though they form the mechanical foundations of the modern world. In the mid-20th century, a British biochemist named Joseph Meehan dedicated his life to this puzzle. He spent decades compiling evidence of Chinese scientific strength, trying to understand why modern science ultimately accelerated in Europe rather than in the East. This map illustrates a clear pattern of diffusion. Through merchant caravans on the Silk Road and maritime trade networks, Chinese knowledge moved slowly westward, passing through the Middle East. When tools like the magnetic compass, gunpowder, and the printing press finally reached European borders, they provided the mechanical leverage needed to end feudalism. Mass literacy, global navigation, and new military tactics multiplied across the continent. In Europe, these specific technologies were adopted and scaled to distribute knowledge, to militarize conflict, and navigate the globe. There is a paradox in technology. When a tool works perfectly, it disappears. We stop thinking about the centuries of trial and error that went into it, and we just use it. Early Chinese diviners realized that a ladle carved from lodestone, a naturally magnetized piece of iron ore, would consistently align itself on a north-south axis. Today, that exact magnetic principle is embedded invisibly into the GPS software on your phone. We don't consciously recognize the moldboard plow when we buy groceries, or the Han Dynasty papermaking process when we hand a cashier a dollar bill. Ultimately, the most enduring human legacy lives inside the perfectly engineered, ordinary objects that we touch every single day. When we think of ancient Chinese engineering, we usually picture massive walls and sprawling palaces above ground. But the true genius that allowed these megacities to survive lies buried in the dirt, within highly sophisticated, hidden plumbing systems. At the Neolithic site of Pingliangtai, archaeologists uncovered a complete urban drainage network dating back 4,000 years. Built with interlocking, standardized ceramic pipes, it was a massive communal effort to manage heavy monsoon floods, constructed long before a centralized state even existed. Hundreds of years later, these civic practices were codified in the Caobangji, an ancient manual detailing Chinese science, technology, and urban planning. It mandated a perfect 9x9 street grid, aligned to a strict north-south axis, designed to mirror the perceived geometric order of the cosmos. But a perfect square grid drawn on parchment faces harsh realities when built on the ground. East Asia's geography is incredibly volatile, dominated by intense summer monsoons and swelling river deltas. To maintain that beautiful, symbolic symmetry on the surface, builders had to engineer massive, highly pragmatic water management systems beneath the paving stones. The city of Guangzhou sits in a low-lying basin, yet it survived thousands of years of flooding using ingenious water doors. As external river levels rise, the hydrostatic pressure physically forces the heavy wooden gate shut, automatically sealing the city from the swelling river. Inside the sealed walls, the internal rainwater drains into a network of open channels called the Fusho Ditch, which empties into large holding ponds. Once the external river level drops, the pressure releases, the doors swing open, and the trapped rainwater drains safely away. Ming-era Beijing handled deluges using a soakwell system. Engineers built underground circular culverts using inverted wedge-shaped bricks with intentional gaps between them. During a heavy rain, water collects in the culvert and rapidly infiltrates the surrounding soil. Modern gray infrastructure often attempts to rush water away as quickly as possible through impermeable concrete pipes, which easily back up and fail. The ancient Chinese philosophy was exactly the opposite: slow the water down and allow the earth to absorb it. The city wall functioned as a primary regulator for a complex hydraulic cycle, managing the flow of water across the entire urban landscape. Managing water was only half the survival equation. To outlast extreme droughts, the state established the Chongping Sang, an empire-wide network of ever-normal granaries specifically designed to stabilize the food supply. These were highly specialized structures. The Mansingkong Imperial Granary in Beijing was built on elevated terrain for natural drainage, featuring 1.5-meter thick walls and subfloor ventilation systems to keep stored grain cool and dry for years. This chart shows how grain prices fluctuate wildly across seasons in an unregulated market. The state used the granaries to enforce the balance law, purchasing grain during surplus years to prevent price crashes, and releasing those reserves during famines to keep food affordable. By heavily fortifying their food reserves against rot and temperature swings, the government made a military-grade investment in social stability, preserving the urban population when nature failed to provide. Because China sits along the Pacific Ring of Fire, builders also had to account for constant seismic threats. They achieved this by designing massive timber halls that sway fluidly during an earthquake, rather than snapping under the stress. The mechanism making this possible is the Tu-Kung system, intricate, nail-free wooden brackets between columns and the roof, acting as shock absorbers. Codified in an 11th century manual, the Tsai mathematical module determined timber sizes, allowing rapid, standardized, earthquake-proof assembly across the empire. Chinese seismic design prioritized pliancy and energy absorption over rigid strength. By using wooden joints that slip and flex under kinetic stress, the structure survived intense tremors where load-bearing stone would simply crumble. Zooming out to the regional scale, we find the ultimate proof of working with nature rather than against it, the Dujiangyan irrigation system. Built in 256 BC without a conventional dam, it still irrigates hundreds of thousands of acres today. At its center sits the fishmouth levee. Using zero mechanical pumps, the structure naturally splits the river's flow. During dry seasons, it funnels 60% of the water inland for agriculture. During heavy rains, it reverses that ratio to expel floodwaters outward. Just downstream, the flying sand weir utilizes centrifugal force. As the water bends rapidly around the channel, the physical momentum ejects excess water and heavy silt over the weir, preventing the vast canal network from clogging. Dujian operates as a massive harmonious machine, successfully translating a river's destructive kinetic energy into a permanent agricultural lifeline. Today, highly paved modern cities are struggling against worsening floods. In response, urban planners are pulling up the concrete and replacing it with permeable green spaces and wetlands designed to catch and filter stormwater. This approach is known as the sponge city model. Pioneered by landscape architect Kang Jin-yu, the concept has been exported globally to massive projects like Benchikitty Forest Park in Bangkok, which actively stores and purifies urban runoff. These contemporary projects share a direct engineering lineage with historical sites, like the 13th century Lijiang town. Both visions succeed by integrating the natural water cycle directly into the urban form. Ancient Chinese engineering provides a durable template for 21st century survival, building cities that act like sponges,